Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hey, my lovely radicals. Merritt in your ears again. How are things? Are you winning at starving diet culture instead of yourself? I really hope so. And you know what? By winning, I don't mean the easy peasy, effortless winning as if you were performing your oldest card trick. I mean quite the opposite, really. Winning in this case looks quite a lot messier than that old card trick, because winning against our internalized diet mentality and winning against our inner gremlin that tells us we're not worthy the way we are, and that we must participate in today's world's weight loss addiction and be an obedient diet culture sheep, that is a win we cannot achieve by just deciding to do so once. So winning actually means realizing that doubts will come up as we grow more self-aware, as we grow more courageous, more able to make our own decisions as opposed to letting others or the outside world, society, decide what we should be, what we should look like, and what we should be doing. Winning is realizing that taking the easy way out and jumping on the next diet wagon will not solve our self-worth issues, and that not putting on a diet band-aid on a soul wound is a heroic, radical act of self-love. Yes, we will stumble, we will fall, but we will move forward. We will grow, we will find out who we really are and who we want to be loyal to. Diets or ourselves, our heart's truth. So celebrate the small wins and be kind to yourself when you feel doubtful or sad or tempted to abandon yourself. This is winning small steps, being in this together, supporting each other, and seeing that we are indeed good enough as we are. And speaking of support, let me give a shout out to those of you who are supporting me on Patreon, this platform where otherwise resources draining projects can be made sustainable by providing small repeat contributions. And so the hugest thank you to Nicola, Vanya, Liet, and Florence this week. Thank you so much for your support. If you want a shout out too, please go to patreon.com/lifeunrestricted and become a so-called Patreon of this podcast of mine. So it's patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. And I will make sure I'll write to you, and I will also give you a shout out here because you're awesome. And now, showtime. In today's episode of the Life Unrestricted podcast, I talked to Evelyn Tribole. Yes, the Evelyn Tribole, the co-author of the groundbreaking bestseller Intuitive Eating and author of several other books. Evelyn Tribole is an award-winning registered dietitian with a nutrition counseling practice in Newport Beach, California. She's specializing in eating disorders, intuitive eating, and celiac disease. Evelyn has a passion for helping people discover a healthy relationship with food, mind, and body, whether that be through one-on-one counseling, writing, workshops, or media appearances. And as we know, she is the very pioneer who co-created the process that we now call intuitive eating. In the 90s, she was the nutrition expert for Good Morning America. She was the national spokesperson for the American Dietetic Association for years, and she has been rated as one of the best nutritionists in the country by many U.S. magazines. As you can imagine, she has had countless media appearances and she has achieved the highest honors one could possibly dream of as an expert dietitian. So speaking of honored, that's how I felt when she expressed her interest to be on my podcast show.
It's wonderful. It's a good synergy.
Yeah, it's good synergy. I think it's also something that I had missed beforehand, how important it is to actually give something back and how good that feels in return. I didn't know. I was like, I had this scarcity mindset all my life, like I didn't get enough love. I didn't get enough anything. So people need to give me something first. And now I'm like, oh, fuck it. I'm going to, I'm going to give, and I'm going to do it until I'm bankrupt, and then we can talk again. But until then, I'm gladly just, providing this resource. So
for you. And I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, that's really nice. And it's an honor, of course, since most people have heard your name, thousands have read your book, but I think only precious few have heard you tell your own story in person. So how was your relationship to food and body when you grew up?
You know what? It's really interesting. I was really lucky on many levels. I had a good relationship, and here's why. I'm going to actually give you some context on this. So in high school, I really wanted to run track, but they didn't have a girls' track team because it was so long ago. So I ran on the boys' team, and I used to beat the boys. But my point in telling you this story, besides my pride in beating the boys, is that at least once a week after we finished a workout, we would all put our legs it's like we're sitting in a circle and we'd all point our legs forward and we'd look at each other's veins on our legs to see who had the most fitness, who had the most anastomosis. In other words, we were taking pride in what our bodies do for us in terms of our function, and I think that was really a very protective effect. And yet I grew up with a dieting mom. And this is one of the saddest stories. It still gets me today when I tell this story. So I knew her ideal weight. When she was 64, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and we were having one of those heart-to-heart, private, deep moments of discussion. And tearfully, we were sitting down and she stood up. She turned her body in a full circle and she goes, "Look at this, all these years of dieting, and all I want to do is live."
Oh God.
Yeah, and she ended up dying, 3 years later. But that was, thank you. That was a really profound moment because I think about that with all the patients that I see whose lives are so distracted and their relationships are so distracted because they're thinking about their body or they're thinking about losing weight or what to eat, what not to eat. And as a result, it's almost as if the relationships they have, it's like when you're talking to somebody on the phone and you can tell they're checking email or doing something else, they're not all there. They're saying all the right words, but the connection's not quite there. And that's what I see happening when people are preoccupied with their bodies. But I had a really positive aspect, though, from my mom. And despite the fact she was constantly dieting, the one thing she always did is she never had shame in her body. We always grew up with her in a bathing suit where no matter what her size was, she was out there swimming and participating and so on. And so that was a really positive modeling for me. And I see today in the patients that I work with eating disorders, usually girls, but sometimes boys, but often their parents have some kind of eating issues too. It's like this cultural neuroses. It's like we need to bring back the dignity of just being a human being and the miracle of that,
Totally. I think we've just forgotten the basics.
Yeah.
So when did it first cross your mind that there needs to be a book on how to relearn to eat according to our own body's rules?
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's it's like the perfect storm, but this time not a storm, but all these things were colliding that lined up at the same time to have this wonderful synergistic effect. So what happened were several things. The movement of the non-dieting movement was growing, where health professionals were saying diets don't work. But when you have something called non-diet, it doesn't really capture, it's hard to visualize. What are you talking about when you say that? So in terms of culturally, that was going on. In terms of my media work, I was starting to do a lot of national media. And I had a wonderful, fortuitous event happen where I was a guest on Good Morning America. And the next guest that was coming on, there was a technical difficulty. And most people don't know this, but national news is very scripted. I mean, not every word, but you have an idea what the questions are and who the guest experts are going to be and so on. So they asked me during the commercial break, could I stay on and do another segment? And I've got 2 minutes to come up with something. And I said, sure. And so I ended up talking about primal hunger. And primal hunger, we talk a lot in the book of intuitive eating. It's our second principle of honoring your hunger. And that is when we get so profoundly hungry, we enter the zone of biology where it doesn't matter what your thoughts are, what your intentions are. It's just like, give me that meal or I'm going to kill you kind of hunger and that kind of intensity. So that generated a lot of interest. And so meanwhile, Elise Rush and I, my co-author, we were in the same suite, and I was telling her about my frustration with all of this, the dieting and the crazy and the madness. And so we had decided, I asked her if she'd like to write a book with me. I think I'd already written about 4 books by that time. And it's kind of funny now to say this, but at the time I was actually kind of scared about writing this. I mean, I've never had any problem standing up to controversy if I had good reason. So I think actually running on the boys' track team and lettering was the beginning of my rebellion, that you do the right thing, even if it, wrinkles a few feathers or whatnot. Because back then you really weren't here dietitian. You didn't hear dietitians saying, oh yes, eat whatever you want. It's really okay, Mm-hmm. But we really, really dug into the research, and the research was really, really out there. And so we ended up, taking our concept and putting it into 10 principles. And so we could say that, intuitive eating, the original premise was really research inspired. But fast forward to today, to 2016, 20 years later, there's now over 60 studies showing benefits of intuitive eating. And I can't tell you how exciting and how gratifying that is, especially when you're starting to see public health policy saying, hey, we need to be doing this health thing a whole entirely different way. So it's exciting. And to me, it also helps people move away from what I call just unnecessary suffering, and the idea that their body is actually can work, it's about rebuilding trust. And so I will often say to a patient that you might not trust your body, but you haven't been very nice to it. And I say it with all kindness and respect, but it never knows when it's going to be fed again. And so what has to happen is a healing. And so every time you are experiencing biological hunger and you put a bite of food in your mouth to nourish that hunger, you build trust with every bite of food that you put into your body. And then with time, you really start to believe, yeah, my body is capable.
What was it that sparked the interest in the whole topic? What made it not so that you believed in diets and did what everyone seems to be doing, but doing the exact opposite?
Oh, you know what it was? Actually, this is both for Elise and I, is we had patients coming in, wanting to lose weight, and we would do the traditional exchanges, which is a food grouping system, make these beautiful plans, and these patients would end up losing weight, but then coming back a couple of years later, regaining all that weight plus more, and then blaming themselves. And we're like, this is wrong. This is, as a health professional, it's not a gratifying way to be working with people. So I think that was really the biggest impetus. And then just looking at the research, and there was a classic study published in the during World War II where they took conscientious objectors, and they were college-age guys. They were healthy from a mind standpoint. They were healthy from a medical standpoint, and they put them on a semi-starvation diet and watched what happened. And what ended up happening is, some of the things were predictable. They lost their hair, their metabolic rate slowed down. But what happened to their minds was just incredible. They became obsessed with food. They started collecting recipes and cookbooks. And keep in mind, this is in the 1940s when we did not have, celebrity chefs and TV cooking shows, and all these guys could do is talk and think about food. They didn't know whether to eat fast or slow. And some of the men actually went out and developed eating disorders. One man could not stand the rules of this regimen, and he went out and stole candy and binged on it, and then felt so guilty he made himself throw up. So we've got, bulimia. And so what ended up happening, this became the classic study of what ends up happening with food restriction on the mind and on the body. And these men, on average, were eating around 1,700 calories, so it wasn't like they weren't eating, And I think that's what people don't really appreciate, is how profound our biology is in terms of surviving, and our bodies will do anything to help us survive, include getting cravings for food, obsessions with food, and all of these types of things. So I think that was something that just really, really spoke to me, and it still does. Like, I don't know if you guys watch The Biggest Loser or have a similar show like that out there in where you're at, but there was a study published this spring where they looked at people who had been on The Biggest Loser, and they followed them 6 years later. And, the New York Times and a lot of media made a big deal. It's like, oh my gosh, they lost, their metabolic rate. It went down by 500 calories a day. And this information actually was not surprising or shocking for those of us who work with eating disorders or with this chronic dieting mentality. But one of the things that wasn't reported in the media but was in the study, and by the way, I'm a research geek. I'm in touch with my inner nerd, so I love reading all this. But these contestants, they lost so much muscle mass that even 6 years later, they still had not regained the muscle mass that they actually started off before the show even started. So we are living in really crazy times where food has become like eating in the name of health, and weight loss has become like this holy war.
Like a religion. Yeah.
It's like religion for absolution, and it's just, and we need to get back to the pleasure of eating and the joy of eating. And I will tell you, I was really, really fortunate early in my career. I had the good fortune of working on Julia Child's task force, the famous chef, celebrity cook. Yeah. And what she was trying to do was to get nutritionists and chefs to kind of get along and look at many things. So we met for months and months and months brainstorming, and we came up with a very simple message, and that is, to the chefs, that when you're cooking and creating these amazing menus and food dishes, please consider health. And to the nutritionists and dietitians of the world, please consider taste and the pleasure of eating when you're making your recommendations. And that had a huge, huge impact on me. Sometimes when people ask me, what do I do for a living? I will say, I teach people how to enjoy eating again. There's something very nice about that, something very healing about that.
I think the first step in the wrong direction happens the minute someone is brought up to the idea that diets should be the thing that they should do, and then it only gets worse from there. So it's best to just not ever have anyone dieting. And you mentioned the Minnesota starvation diet before, and one thing that really caught my attention, rather than the fact that they were obsessed with food, which I thought, yeah, of course they would be, and it reminded me of myself and my behavior around food as well, but also the mental health issues that started to come up, like anxiety and anger and isolation, and they lost their libido, and all sorts of stuff started to happen, and they were eating. It was not a real starvation, and that should make everyone snap awake. So I think it bears endless repeating the fact that diets don't work, and because it seems like people are still believing or hoping that they will work for them long term, but they won't. So what is your message to those who won't let go of the belief that maybe the next diet will be the one that will stick long term?
And you hit the nail on the head. They believe just one more diet, this time it'll be different. So one of the things I also stress, besides this famous study, is that diets actually cause you to gain more fat. In fact, there's been some profound studies out that really show the problem. There's been a lot of research showing that, people who diet end up gaining more weight in the long run beyond what they already started with. And so there were a group of researchers who said, well, maybe people are gaining this weight not because of dieting. Maybe it's because they have a genetic disposition to gaining weight. So they took a look at twins. They took a look at 2,000 sets, 2,000 pairs of twins or 4,000 people, and followed them for about 5 years. And what they found just blew my mind, because the relationship they found is that dieting independent of genetics had a dose response in terms of weight gain. So in other words, the more that one twin dieted, the more their weight would go up. And this has been shown over and over again. There's even been a mechanism that's been identified called fat overshooting, that dieting, especially when your weight is on the lower side, when you diet, it triggers a mechanism, again, a survival compensatory mechanism that causes a rebound of actually gaining not just more weight, but weight in the way of fat. So one of the things, and I say this to doctors, because doctors and healthcare professionals need to get this message. It's not like dieting or this kind of weight loss is helping. Would you give a cholesterol medication to a patient that caused heart attacks in the long run? That maybe it lowered their cholesterol in the beginning, but then caused their arteries to slam shut. There's no way in hell any drug would pass the test. It wouldn't even be into market. And yet, for some reason, with dieting, it's looked at differently. And then when you look at all the research coming out on the obesity paradox, which basically is showing, hey, guess what? The researchers were wrong. But actually, when you're at a higher weight, it actually predicts surviving more diseases and other maladies. And there's a really good book by Carl Levy called The Obesity Paradox, and he's both a cardiologist and a researcher. So he's in the trenches, and he's the one saying, oh my God, we got this so wrong. We need to be focusing on health, and we need to be focusing on fitness. And so that's the message that needs to get out there. And then one of my biggest concerns, too, are with families, because parents are feeling the pressure. And if they have a kid that's, overweight according to the growth charts, they feel like this need to, quote, do something, or it means that they're a bad parent. And the research has been really striking on this. There was a really cool study that was done on college-age students. And what they did is they had them fill out a questionnaire that evaluated what it was like growing up in terms of the feeding practices by their parents. And then they gave this same questionnaire to the parents. So basically they were looking at this period of life when they were toddlers and, young age. And what they found is that the parents that were monitoring and restricting their kids' intake, they grew up to be the college-age kids who scored low on intuitive eating and had a higher rate or risk of binge eating. So it's not like this stuff works. It's like, people, we need to wake up. This is causing harm. That's the message that needs to get out there. Not that dieting doesn't work, but actually dieting can really mess you up.
I got a stupid question. Why are diets even allowed? I mean,
oh my God, I know. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there was big headline news in the United States about how Weight Watchers, their stock's really going down, and they're listing all of these, business aspects. And I'm thinking, hey, media, don't you know consumers are starting to wise up that diets don't work and create bigger problems? Maybe that's why the stock. Yeah, I think it's actually unethical to recommend any kind of dieting. It's really, really unethical. And when you look at the data, that it causes worse problems, worse obsession, higher weight gain, and more fat. How in the world is that healthier,
It's crazy. I don't understand. I really don't understand it. And you mentioned the obesity paradox, and I think we should even stop calling this a paradox, because they seem to just explain it away by, it is a paradox. It's a freak of nature thing, when in fact it's not.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting because, I train health professionals how to facilitate intuitive eating with their clients and patients. And sometimes where they really struggle, they have kind of like this guilt that they should be doing something to promote not dieting, but, quote, healthy weight loss. And it's like, as long as you stand in the middle of the road like that, you're going to get hit, Mm-hmm. And we're on the line. And maybe a patient's going to hear this for the first time, that dieting is going to make your health worse. And what we need to do is reframe the whole conversation around health, period. What are healthy behaviors that are sustainable? Whether it's finding an exercise or an activity that you enjoy, as opposed to something that burns the highest amount of calories, or whether it's even starting off really simply at looking at, well, how much time do you spend sitting in interrupted periods, uninterrupted, where there's actually fascinating research looking at that in terms of the health consequences. And there's so many things that we can be doing. And ultimately, it puts the client and the patient front and center. They are the experts of their body. They know their thoughts. They know their feelings. They know what foods satisfy and what don't. And so we need to be coming together and working in a collaborative way. But what ends up happening is so many of patients I see for the first time, they have so much shame around their bodies and their weight, and they feel like there's something just really aberrantly wrong about them, when actually it's the process of dieting that has actually hurt them. What still amazes me is that when I'm taking a history from somebody and then I'm asking about their dieting history, and they'll say, oh yeah, that diet really worked, And I'm thinking, really? Maybe it took some weight off, but let's look at what happened afterwards. What happened to your weight and how much weight came back on and how did that compare to what your baseline was? And so that they can still have the mindset or the belief that that diet actually works. So that's one thing I have people do, is really challenge that. Is that really true? Is that really true? And the answer is no, it's not.
When I was talking to Linda Bacon about that as well, we kind of nailed it down to also the fact that people with larger bodies are being shamed and they're being discriminated against, and that is a huge detriment to anyone's health. And that's one thing that makes me so angry about diets and the concept of diets too, because inherently in the concept of dieting there is the blame and the guilt and the shame, because if you can't make it with that diet, it's your fault.
Right.
And that's, I think, culturally so wrong, that we put the blame on people that are in larger bodies as if they had done something wrong, as if it wasn't just diversity showing itself. You know what I mean?
I'm so with you on that. And that's one of the messages, too, I think that's so important. And that is, you cannot tell by looking at somebody's body whether they're healthy or unhealthy. You have no idea. And yet, a lot of people think they're experts in this because they eat. And they want to tell you what to do. But this comes back, this whole idea about the dignity of being a human being. I'll never forget having a patient I saw for the first time, and I asked her a very basic question, like, what brings her here today? And she looked at me and she goes, well, isn't that obvious? She goes, obviously I eat too much, as she's, surveying her own body. And I looked at her, I said, no, that's not obvious to me. And I listed a variety of reasons why she could be here. And all of a sudden she started crying. And I said to her, oh my goodness, did I say something that offended you, or what prompted the tears? And she said, Evelyn, you are the first health professional I've ever seen in my entire life who didn't blame anything that was going on with me about my body. She said, I could have an earache and the doctor would say it's because you need to lose weight, And she said it was like the first time she ever felt like she was listened to. And so I think that's something we really need to keep in mind. We have no idea what's going on with somebody,
Thank God she met you, yes. And so what do you think about binge eating disorder? Where does that stem from? Because my thoughts are that it's a consequence of deprivation. But I'm not sure what your thoughts on it are.
I have lots of thoughts on this. Okay. So I need to write something on this paper. When you start looking at all the research that looks at dieting and binge eating, it's really, really striking that there's a strong, strong correlation. And the one that really got me is when they looked at little kids. I think they were like ages 8 to 12 or something. And they looked at little kids who dieted a little bit, never, or a lot. And the kids who dieted a lot got engaged in binge eating. And so I think what it ends up being is kind of a 3-factor response. Number one is that when you are biologically deprived, when you are not getting enough nourishment, it sets into motion a biological cascade where you're going to start wanting more food and thinking about food all the time. And it drives me crazy when people call this food addiction. It's like, no, this is a natural consequence of when you're not eating. I had this discussion with a patient. She was on a long road trip, and there was no bathroom. And she said, she couldn't stop thinking about where's the bathroom, where's the bathroom. And I said, the same thing with eating when you've been biologically deprived. But the psychological deprivation is also profound, because when you think you're never going to be able to eat a food again, and you really, really believe it, like I shouldn't eat it, this is the last time, it really creates this Last Supper eating. It's a say goodbye to food feast because you're never, ever going to have it again. And it's really, really profound. And when you start looking at the research just going on around like thought deprivation, it actually causes a paradoxical rebound effect where you actually start thinking more about that very thing and wanting even more of it. And so this is one of the areas that we really took a hard look at the research in terms of this idea of unconditional permission to eat. It's one of the core characteristics of intuitive eating, and it's probably one of the misunderstood ones. And what this is about, it's making peace with food, which is about having unconditional permission to eat with attunement. And when you have permission to eat, it changes everything. You really get to ask, well, gosh, I can have these cookies anytime. Do I really want to eat them now? If I eat them now, will I enjoy them? And when you know that you can have them anytime, you can easily have it later if you wish. Or I have patients who end up discovering, oh my gosh, I don't even really care for these cookies, but they were so in the, I'm doing something wrong and naughty, better get it, now while I can, but not even tasting. Or sometimes what ends up happening is they start experiencing for the first time what's going on with their body. That maybe they eat some kind of or donuts or something or pastry, and it's like, oh, gosh, yeah, I like the taste of this, but I don't like how I feel physically. So all of these things start to happen, and it's the paradox of permission, that when you actually have permission to eat, you end up eating less of these very foods that you were binging over or lusting over or indulging over, whatever word you want to use. So it's really profound. So I get really, I'm really frustrated right now with the research going on the so-called food addiction. Oh. And So I think at best we can call it a controversy. We can call it a theory. When you start looking at the research, it's not really there. And when you look at the study that really kicked off the interest, it was a kind of a famous study done out at Princeton University where they took two groups of rats. They had identical conditions except for one. One group of the rats got starved for like 12 hours, but the rest of the eating conditions were the same. So one group got starved for 12 hours, the other did not, and then they were exposed to foods with lots of sugar. And the rats that had this starvation response ended up binge eating on the sugar. And so, oh my gosh, the media went crazy. Some scientists went crazy and saying, yeah, food addiction, it's really happening biologically. But the piece they're missing is, wait a minute. Let's look at the thing that got it started. It was food restriction. That's what got this whole mess to begin with, because the rats that didn't starve didn't have this consequence with sugar. So then the other thing that really gets me is that when you start looking at some of these studies where they look at brain imaging, they'll say, oh my gosh, it lit up, the cocaine euphoria region in the brain, you're addicted to food. Most of the research has not looked at confounders such as, is this person on a diet? When was the last time they ate? Because what happens is when you are hungry or you've been dieting, your mind, your brain is biologically wired to be thinking more about food and have a more rewarding aspect to seeking it out. That's how we survived as a species. So that's not addiction. That's survival. And what really got me thinking about this is a series of studies. A study that just got my attention was these group of researchers looked at people who not only enjoy music, but they get a physiological response. They get goosebumps upon hearing beautiful music. And so they took these groups of people, and what they did is they measured their dopamine levels, which reflects, the rewarding value of anything. And then they looked at their brain scans and looked at the area that would light up upon listening to music. And what they found is that the mere anticipation of listening to music lit up the dopamine aspect, and then listening to the music lit up the cocaine euphoria region associated with addiction. And yet there's no one I've ever talked to that would interpret this study as, oh my God, you can be addicted to music, Mm-hmm. So, and they've done studies too where they've taken moms and looked at their brains while they were looking at images of their babies. The babies are smiling, and that lit up that reward area in the brain as well. So there's so much to be learned in this whole fascinating field. But I think what's also adding the confusion is the Yale Food Addiction Scale. So here we have a very respected university with the name in the scale, and then food addiction as if it's a fact. And when this study first came out, they looked at creating criteria that would, quote, define food addiction and can you measure it? And they said, yeah. And so as I'm reading their study, I'm thinking, how in the world do you get a significant population of food addiction in Yale college students? You know what I mean? That didn't make sense to me. And I finally got my hands on the study where I actually got to look at the questions. I go, oh my God, now I get it. The questions really reflected the consequences of dieting. Do you worry and think about food a lot? Those kinds of things. And so when I started thinking about the statistics on the amount of people who are engaging in diets, we know that about half of women are dieting at any given moment, and about a third to a fourth of men are dieting. And I thought, oh, so if we take that in a college population, no wonder they, quote, scored significance on food addiction. So I think what you have here is you're measuring something very significant, but it's not food addiction. It's the consequence of food restriction, that your mind gets overly valued on eating and thinking about food. And the reason I get all intense and passionate about this is I find it's really disempowering for people, to think that they're powerless over food, that they're failures at dieting, and now they can't help themselves because they're addicted. And it's just an unnecessary thing to be adding to someone's quality of life, to think that you can't be eating certain kinds of foods. And yet, while I feel very strongly about this, I'm going to meet a patient where they're at. If they're too scared to eat something with sugar, I'm certainly not going to start them there. But when someone hasn't been getting enough to eat biologically, let's say they're afraid of carbohydrates, so maybe for lunch they have your classic, big old salad with chicken, no dressing, hold the croutons, and some iced tea, they might feel physically full after eating that, but their body knows. It's like, dude, where are the carbs? Where's the energy for this brain? And you're going to start seeking out and craving carbohydrate-based foods, not because you're a food addict, because your body needs this vital energy source. So I think it's just adding unnecessary suffering is what it's doing.
Why no one is stressing a classical music addiction or mom is smiling at you addiction is because it's just not selling as well as the whole fear mongering that is going on. I mean, capitalism is rubbing its hands when we are the fear mongering about sugar is toxic, and the comparison of sugar to cocaine, as ridiculous as it sounds, obviously people are buying into this, and that makes them sheep. They will buy anything, they will do any programs, and there you have it. It's money again.
Yeah. And we're just living in crazy times. Even the term clean eating drives me crazy. Because it implies, actually, when someone tells me that, I will say, well, you know what? I like to eat dirty.
Yes.
I'll say, think about carrots. They come from the earth. It's a dirty food, in that respect. Yes. But psychologically, when someone says that they're eating clean, that's implying that there's something about the way they normally eat that's impure or dirty or unfit or something. And so that I think is really, really problematic. And all the stuff that comes up with that, the quote juice cleanses and all these kinds of things that our body is perfectly capable of handling on its own.
God, all the detoxes and everything. It's ridiculous. Once you see behind all it gets really ridiculous to see, but it pains me also to see that so many people are falling into the trap. And also, I think it must be hard for you to watch just how many people are turning intuitive eating into just another diet. Isabel Fox-and-Duke has coined this expression, so-called hunger and fullness diet, I think. And she's so right. I mean, how does that work? People are managing to turn everything into a diet. So is it really just the internalized fat phobia that makes us unable to learn intuitive eating as it was once designed?
I think what it is, it's the mindset. And if you have the mindset of a dieter with thinking that's kind of all or none or black or white, of course they're going to view anything in those terms. And so one of the things I stress with intuitive eating, it's a set of 10 principles. It's not a set of 10 rigid rules, with intuitive eating, it's not pass or fail. Every experience is a meaningful experience, even the ones that are upsetting to you, because you can really learn something from it. I mean, I've had patients say, oh my God, I blew it. I ate when I wasn't hungry. That's a very diet mentality mindset that they're applying to intuitive eating. And I'll say, well, why does that mean that you blew it? You know, what happened afterwards? Were you less hungry at your next meal, for example? They're not looking at all of this. Or a converse example I'll see is with someone who they perceive, let's say that they overate at lunch. And so the chronic dieter will then try to micromanage and do everything they can to compensate. They'll have less at dinner, or they're going to say they're not going to eat any dinner at all. And what ends up happening then is they rob themselves of the experience to see what their bodies would have naturally done. Their body, if they truly overate, let's say at lunch, they're really not going to be as hungry at dinner time. It's just... It can be crazy making. So I guess the caution I would have on there is that these are not rigid rules. It's not pass or fail.
It seems like there's just so many people that have heard about the book but not actually read it. I think that's those people who are turning it into a diet. And your book is an international bestseller, and many people have, as I said, have heard about it and maybe seen the picture of the book. But the term is being thrown around in, how do I say, in circles that are not really competent to talk about intuitive eating. And so it ends up being, I don't know, butchered and not being done as it was once intended. So could you just explain the guidelines and principles so that we can dispel some of the myths?
Yeah. So, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why we started training and certifying health professionals, because we found that some of them are also butchering it as well. We wanted to stay true to the model. The official definition of intuitive eating, it's an evidence-based approach with 10 specific principles and its own assessment tools. And when we talk about intuitive eating, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about whatever the street definition might be. And the 10 set of principles are very, very flexible. So the first principle is rejecting the dieting mentality, because as long as your mind is on a diet, or you're talking like a diet, I've had patients say, well, I'm not dieting, but then they'll talk about how they're really eating paleo, and they will absolutely not eat certain foods. Like, well, that's a form of dieting. The second principle is honoring your hunger. And that sounds so basic and pretty straightforward. In fact, I had a patient say to me, she goes, well, Evelyn, if I understand intuitive eating, it's, eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. And I said, yeah, those are two key components for sure, but let's look at your life and what that would mean. And in her case, she was a lovely, lovely person, but a people pleaser who would do anything for her grandkids and her kids at the expense of not feeding her body. And so I said, let's look what it would take for you to honor your hunger in a timely manner in that way. And she goes, oh my God, this is going to take forever. So the next principle, which we just talked about, was making peace with food, which has to do with unconditional permission to eat whatever food you want, but with attunement. The next is challenging the food police. Oh my gosh, this is even more profound today than it was when we wrote the book. And this has to do with challenging the food rules and the food belief systems that you have, whether you've unknowingly embraced the rules from your dieting family or from friends or culture or anything like that. The fifth principle is feeling your fullness. Now, that sounds pretty basic also, but when we think about, basically it means, stopping eating when you're comfortably full, we're living in such a time of distraction. And so if you're eating and doing something else at the same time, like checking email or texting, you really don't get so connected to the fullness qualities. And so that's what I find is difficult for a lot of people, not the intellectual understanding of honoring fullness, but actually being willing to do it while not engaging in any other activity. The sixth principle is discovering the satisfaction factor. And this is a really important principle. Every principle is important, but this is kind of like the hub, because if you think about it, if you have someone aim for satisfaction in their eating, it's a principle that actually helps to get you into balance while connecting to your body. For example, it doesn't feel so satisfying to eat a meal and come away like you didn't get enough to eat. And it's not satisfying ultimately to overeat. And so just about every other principle is also connected to this. The seventh principle is honoring your emotions without using food. And one of the big ironies on this, when you start looking at the research of chronic dieters, that there's something unique about dieting that makes people more vulnerable to self-soothing or coping with their feelings by using food. So it gets complex. The eighth principle is respecting your body. And, we really spent a lot of time really figuring out the terminology to use this. Because back when we wrote Intuitive Eating with the first edition, it was common in with psychologists and therapists to be talking about loving your body. And it's a very beautiful thing to aspire to. But what we found with so many of our clients and patients is that when they hate their bodies and when they're at war, to even suggest to love your body was such a faraway concept, we couldn't even connect. We needed something more of a bridge. And we found that if we started saying, well, how about respecting your body? You might not like it, you might not love it, but can you respect it? And what would that look like? What would it be like to treat your body nicely, with a little bit of kindness, for example? The ninth principle is feeling the difference with exercise. It's about movement for the sake of pleasure and feeling good, not for the sake of, weight loss. And then ironically, the 10th and final principle of intuitive eating is honoring your health with gentle nutrition. And it's ironic because, Elise and I both have master's degrees in nutrition science. And it's not that nutrition's not important. What we've seen over and over and over again is if you take someone who's a chronic dieter or who has rigid eating around, so-called nutritious eating, if we start too soon with that, it really interferes with them becoming attuned to the sensations of what's going on with their body. And so this is a really dynamic, integrative approach. And ultimately, it's about trusting your body,
Where do your clients experience the most difficulty when applying the principles?
That's a good question. So I'll tell you where the difficulty lies for a lot of people. We've talked a lot today about respecting your body and focusing on health, and we will tell people it's important to put desire of weight loss on the back burner. And in fact, the first two editions of our book, on the cover, one of the descriptions said something to the effect of, get to the natural weight that your body was meant to be. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that, we discovered, is that, some people do lose weight with intuitive eating, but what ends up happening is that people end up judging their ability to be an intuitive eater based on what's going on with their weight. And so what that does, it really takes the focus off of listening to your body. So with our third edition, we went to our publisher and asked them to take it off the cover. And so we took all mentions of numbers off of that. So what I find with people that they have difficulty with is when they've read the book, it really resonates with them. It makes a lot of sense, and they want to become an intuitive eater. And yet often where they're at in their lives and in their bodies, they're feeling miserable in their body. What ends up happening is someone will start making decisions based on eating based on what their weight was or based on how many calories or not how many calories that is in it. The other struggle I often hear is it's not happening fast enough, and someone I'll say to my patients is like, you can't do any crash intuitive eating. We need to be cultivating an environment where they're free to talk about these things and the frustration, because ultimately what it means is, what do you need right now? What do you need today in order to tolerate this process? Someone will talk about they're jumping out of their skin, And quite often I've been surprised at the amount of my patients that wear clothing that really don't fit them. They're too tight. They don't feel comfortable. So one of the things I'll suggest is maybe even just going out and buying a couple of pieces of key clothing, because otherwise it's very, very triggering. That is, something we also came up with in the third edition, that ultimately intuitive eating is about the pursuit of authentic health. And the reason we use the word authentic is we can be integrating health guidelines, but we're integrating it with you, with what your body is feeling, what is satisfying for you. And that makes it more authentic as opposed to just some random, guidelines for the masses.
And I like that you made the hardest principle the first one, because it doesn't make much sense if we can't master the first principle, which is getting rid of the diet mentality. But I do think it's the hardest because rather than food being an addiction, I believe that dieting can turn into an addiction. and that we are numbing out a lot of feelings and a lot of our vulnerabilities and fears of rejection by constantly dieting. So I believe...
I'm completely agreeing with you. It becomes the way of life. It becomes their coping mechanism. It actually keeps them in fantasy land. They have the fantasy of what life will be like. It's keeping them out of their present everyday life. It's also giving them a focus. It's giving them distraction. But it's also affecting, I will sometimes ask people, how distracting is it for you to be dieting? How does this affect your mood? How does this affect your patience with your little kids? And sometimes I get parents as patients who start crying because they're realizing they get really cranky. And so one of the things I have people start to do in the very beginning is just notice how they're starting to feel. Notice what's happening to the background anxiety. Notice what's happening to your energy level. Notice what's happening to the thought process of eating, because what ends up happening as you start to be willing to feed your body more of the food that it needs, you're not obsessing as much about food and worrying about it. And that's a very, very peaceful feeling. And so ultimately, this is always about connecting. It's just having awareness of physical states, like when you're feeling physically sleepy or that you need to empty your bladder. Every emotional feeling has a physical sensation. So once you start to connect and value the physical sensations going on with your body, it gives you powerful, powerful information. But when we're too distracted and living in our minds with our rules about how to be living life, we're disconnecting from our body. So one of the things I will do with my patients is I will ask them, if you think about their own life, and I work with a lot of successful people, think about this. A lot of success in our culture is left-brained activity. It's linear thinking. It's doing things in a certain order. It's very, very logical. Dieting is a left brain activity. It's following the directions. It might be counting depending on what diet you're on. But when we start looking at intuitive eating, that's actually right brain activity. And so I've asked my patients, I go, well, how much experience do you have where right brain activity has been valued either in your education or your training? And they started laughing at me. Mm-hmm. I said, I think never. I said, good. And I say, good for this reason, that you're starting off on basically ground zero. So how would you expect to master something in which you've had no, exposure with? It's no different than when a toddler is learning to walk for the first time. It's brand new. They look like they're drunk little monkeys with their hands in the air. It's so delightful. Half the time they're falling down. And what we hear is the parents just encouraging them, oh, that's great, sweetie, you can do it. But when it comes to something that's brand new to an adult, like stopping dieting and instead listening to their body, they can be so hard on themselves. So if instead we can cultivate this idea that basically you're like a toddler with this aspect of eating. I've had so many adults say to me, Evelyn, I just don't know how to eat anymore. And when they say that, this is what we're really talking about. It's this connectedness, this right brain. It's connecting to the physical sensations and what that really means in terms of your needs, as opposed to just listening and creating new sets of rules. So I will say in that way, it's like, yeah, that's right, And I say that in a really good way, that if no one's ever taught you this before, it would make sense that it's a struggle. Let's go learn this new way that's been scientifically validated. How exciting is that?
I think intuitive eating has a lot to do with self-compassion and self-care.
Oh, it's so interesting that you say that. As we were finishing up our workbook, and the workbook is basically tons of exercises for each of the intuitive eating principles, and Elise and I divided up the chapters, and what we realized is that, wow, if we were to be starting off again creating the intuitive eating book and model, we probably would have had an 11th principle, which would have been self-care, and compassion right with that. In fact, we have a big component of self-care and compassion in the workbook, because you really need both of those. If you're running around stressed out and barely surviving life, you actually might not be able to hear your hunger signals, let alone respond in a timely manner. It has nothing to do with intellect or knowledge. It just has to do where you're at in life. And at the same time, if you haven't cultivated compassion for yourself in this process, oh my goodness, how in the world are you going to be willing to access and listen to your thoughts and your rules and your belief if all you're going to be hearing is nasty talk, So if instead we can come from this place of curious compassion, it makes a huge difference in this whole process. It's about being gentle with yourself.
Yeah, that's totally new because none of us has been taught this. It's all been punishment-based and shame-based.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And so one way of looking at this is kind of a pleasure-based eating that's connected to your unique needs, and only you can be the expert of you. And so when I teach this to teenagers, oh my goodness, they embrace this. It's like, you can't tell me what to do, which is great. We all need to take that mindset,
But how do you help people letting go of that so-called thin dream that they've been holding on to all their lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I spend a lot of time with that with my patients. And first of all, even just labeling it as a dream or a fantasy, I think is really, really helpful. And for many people, it's going through stages of grieving. I've had patients in tears when they start describing and realizing how much time has been spent in the pursuit of weight loss, how much money has been spent, how distracted they've been in their lives. I was working with this one client for a couple of years, and she said, it really made her sad to realize that even when she was getting married, it was all about dieting down to the dress size. And then on her wedding day, she was actually more excited about all the food she could eat as opposed to the actual getting married. And that made her profoundly sad as she started realizing that was actually a pattern with many other important events in her life. And so I think part of it is we have to have compassion and recognize we're living in a culture that validates and promotes this appearance-based stuff. It foists upon us this idea that we can be losing weight with no harm and no consequences. And so for many people, it's the first time they're really hearing this message. And I think that's really important, that you're doing the best that you can until you hear otherwise. I've had patients in their 50s and their 60s saying, God, I wish I heard this when I was a teenager, or even when I was in college. It would have saved me years and years and years. And so what I also say to health professionals working with someone with intuitive eating, they might not be ready. And maybe you're the first health professional to tell them that dieting doesn't work, that it creates bigger problems. But they're going to remember, maybe they need to hear it 5 times, and maybe you're going to be the first person. And nothing thrills me more is when this person comes back. It might be a couple of years later, but they're ready, and they really see the harm that ends up happening with diet after diet after diet.
Mm-hmm. And you are specializing in eating disorders.
Yeah.
And disordered eating also, which I do believe is turning into an epidemic, as we're all being under this constant barrage of toxic messages about our bodies and food. So how does your work with the different eating disorders look like?
Well, it's interesting. It's different and it's similar at the same time, but here's the difference, and this is an important thing for people to realize, for those listening out there who might be in the throes of an eating disorder. First of all, no one wakes up one day and says, hey, I want an eating disorder, I'm going to be bulimic, I'm going to be anorexic. It's a slow descent into hell. It's a hijacking of the brain, and many times the person's not even aware that they're into this place until they're really hooked in. That's number one. Number two, as a consequence, by the time I'm seeing someone with a bona fide eating disorder, they're so disconnected, and when you've got malnourishment happening, when you have anxiety around eating happening, it's really hard to listen, let alone respond in a timely manner to hunger. You have maybe someone with anorexia who takes pride in being hungry, or they define hunger as, oh, I'm almost going to pass out. It's like, no, that's not normal hunger. Or maybe someone will define fullness as the absence of hunger, or they'll define fullness as meaning it means I ate too much. It means I'm going to be fat. So in the first phase, what really happens is nutrition rehabilitation. We're not using very much intuitive eating. I will use it in conjunction, but it's not the overarching thing. And so what I will say is this: when you're in the throes of an eating disorder, it's like having a broken arm. And when you have a broken arm, you're going to need a cast to help support the healing. You're going to need that cast as a structure to help support the healing, but the goal is not to keep that cast on for the rest of your life. And so the same thing in the beginning of an eating disorder, you're going to need to be working with your health team and using some kind of meal planning system. And then once you are through most of that first phase of nutrition rehabilitation, we start working more with intuitive eating. But even with that said, I still start working with it in the very beginning. So I might have someone that I'm working with using a meal plan, and they're still not even where they need to be in terms of having enough energy or enough calories, and we gradually work their way up. But what I tell them, like on a first session, is that, what I'd like you to do this week as you go about this meal plan that you've committed to, is I want you to listen for signs of hunger in terms of, I'd rather have your body inform us where's the next best place for us to add more nourishment. So it doesn't seem, so it's more connected in this process. And so it's a way for them also to get some meaning and even to have a discussion. Well, what does hunger feel like for you? Or I've had patients with binge eating disorder who will describe to me they're terrified of hunger. And so I ask them, well, what do you do if you're afraid of hunger? And they'll say to me, well, I try to ignore it. I try to distract myself. And then what's so sad about that is it ends up creating their worst fear. They get so hungry. It's like a biological hijacking combined now with the emotional place that they're in, and it makes it really very, very difficult and feels very, very chaotic. And so then in the second phase of working with someone with eating disorders, you've probably heard of cognitive behavior therapy, but part of the work I do, I made up this name because I think I like it. I call it cognitive somatic restructuring. And basically all that is really looking at and experiencing what your body is feeling with eating and taking out the distortion. So if someone, feels that if they have a little slight fullness, that they might view that as wrong, they might view that as overeating, when no, this is actually normal. Or actually, in order to eat enough, your body needs even a higher level of or a more intense level of fullness. And so sometimes they need to get desensitized to that. And sometimes what I also do, not just with my patients with eating disorders, but with anyone I'm working with, just basic hunger and fullness, I also have them look at the qualities of it. And that is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So what does pleasant hunger, feel like to you versus what does unpleasant feel like? Because the thing is, if you're waiting to get to a point of hunger that it's unpleasant, that's waiting too long. And conversely with fullness, if you're eating to a point of fullness where you're having unpleasant fullness, well, that doesn't feel good either. Well, what does pleasant fullness feel like? And how do we capture the sensations of that? So I will tell you, this work is so gratifying and meaningful because lives really change, whether or not someone has an eating disorder or they've just been a chronic dieter. Because in order to become an intuitive eater, you really need to have self-care in place. And to get self-care in place, you need to be in a healthy place also psychologically. It might mean speaking up to get your needs met. And so as that starts to happen, as you start to honor your body and its needs, you start to cultivate a sense of trust that also pervades other areas of your life, where you just it's this groundedness that you end up experiencing that's just really profound.
I think it ripples out positively in all areas of life.
That's
and
exactly.
I want to talk about something specific. On your website, you have gathered a massive amount of resources on the topic of intuitive eating and also on eating disorders, which I found really helpful. And one of those articles sparked my attention. Being an exercise addict who is in recovery, it was an article on eating disorders and athletes. And I find that with many people, eating disorders go unnoticed with athletes because, one, being sporty is being applauded, two, being skinny is applauded, and three, it looks like they eat normally or even massive amounts like I do. And many disorder behaviors are being downright encouraged in this case. And for me, that meant that I could live in denial for ages, thinking that my behavior with food and exercise was normal, that my low pulse was healthy, and not having a period wasn't that bad, quote unquote. So how do you help people recognize whether their behavior around food and exercise are truly health promoting for them, or whether they're simply self-destructing themselves without even noticing?
I work with a lot of athletes, and actually because of my athletic background, so one of the things I even start with is this idea, it might look like you're eating enough compared to your peers who aren't exercising or training as much as you are, but the research is really profound and consistent that when you're not getting enough to eat, it destroys your own muscle tissue. You're cannibalizing your own muscle tissue. And here you're working so hard to actually accumulate that. And so and the other thing that also makes it confusing, I think, for athletes or just people with exercise abuse is that, especially when you're engaged in intense exercise, it temporarily blunts hunger. And so you might actually say to yourself, oh, but I'm not really hungry. Or you just have a yogurt and you just got done running 10 miles. That's not a meal. That's barely even a snack. And you might be feeling, I call it falsely justified or validated that you're doing just fine. But it ends up coming out somewhere else. I'm always looking at where that somewhere where else is in terms of how often and how worried and preoccupied they are about eating and about their body and ultimately their quality of life. What it is, I'm constantly looking at when I'm working with individuals is what's important for them, what's meaningful for them. And so when I'm working with college age students and athletes, they might actually be finding that their worry about their body and their eating is distracting them from their social life, or they're turning down invitations to do fun things because they're worried about the eating aspect. And so you're right. The biggest issue on this, it goes easily unnoticed. Even with physicians, they often miss it because they see that, oh, they're eating a couple thousand calories when it turns out they need to be eating 4,000. I'll give you a really profound example. In this case, this athlete did not have an eating disorder, but there's so many similarities. He was a very elite cyclist. He trained, oh my God, I think 30 hours a week. That was his full-time job. And he came into me saying that he's lazy.
3 hours a day, probably, I mean.
No, I want to say 30. He was doing long rides. He was a distance.
30 a week.
Yeah, 30 hours. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, as I assessed what he was needing, I said, you know what? You're only getting about 1/10 of the energy level that you need. I said, you're not lazy. Your poor body is exhausted. And I told him, I can't wait to see how you're going to feel both in your training and your performance. And so that's one of the things I start doing with athletes right away is having them notice what it's like when they're nourishing their bodies during their training in terms of their effort. And so what tends to happen when they're not eating enough, it's grueling effort, but because they have the mind of an athlete, they just power it through. But as they start to eat, they notice a huge difference. And so I'll start getting athletes who will say, gosh, you know what? I forgot to eat breakfast this morning. I noticed it in my performance when I was swimming. So the difference is when I'm working with an athlete who's under eating, not because they have an eating disorder or they're obsessed about their weight or appearance, they just have maybe a crazy schedule, they will start seeing differences right away. But when I'm working with an athlete who's here's actually a good red flag for those who are listening. If you're an athlete in a sport and you're actually doing more than what your coach is recommending, in other words, you're doing the training with your team and then you're going out and doing something else on top of that's usually a huge red flag. So when you've got an athlete who also has an eating disorder, now we're also working with also issues around fear and anxiety. And so it might take them a little longer to start noticing some of these differences in terms of performance. So those are some of the ways that I work with them.
They're probably just afraid of eating more or exercising less because that would mean, again, letting go of the thin dream. That was where my fear is circling around usually.
Yeah, that's going to be like. And what's your fear that if you don't attain this certain body, what does that mean for you? What's going on to your quality of life right now as you've been trying to attain that? And that can be really sad as they start really looking at, wow, they're isolating and engaging in all kinds of behaviors that are just actually taking them further and further away from relationships. And then often what ends up happening is they end up just getting so tired that all they're doing is exercising and then sleeping. And if they're in school, they're going to school, but they're too tired to even do things with other people and not even realizing, again, it's this slow immersion into hell. But I'll tell you, it's so exciting as they start to nourish their body and start to feel alive again, and the connections they start having as a result of that. It's actually really incredible.
It's beautiful for you to mention that also, that there's hope, and once we start the process, that there are also good feelings coming up, and seeing that how much time have I wasted or doing over exercising and everything, how much time was wasted doing all that and worrying, and seeing that I could spend my life in other ways. I mean, that helps also to snap out of it a little bit and face the fear. So it's nice to hear you say that there's hope for people out there.
And I think that's a huge message for people with eating disorders, that this is very treatable, but it's going to take working with a team, And so finding out what is it that you need to do to take your first step, whether you're going to connect with a therapist or a dietitian, a physician who specializes in eating disorders, but getting your team together. And one of the things that just really strikes me is the level of exhaustion they're experiencing, and they're not even aware. They're just numb, so numb. And, in California, we're kind of known for driving cars all over the place. And so an analogy I use a lot is like driving your car with really dirty windows, but you don't know the windows are dirty. And you finally get a chance to go to the car wash, and you get your car cleaned, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I can see. How did I see before? So it's kind of like that with energy and exhaustion,
So probably the first stage might be just resting and allowing the exhaustion to come up, and then just I found that really unsettling when I started to rest more, just to see how exhausted I was. That brought up all the fear. Like, see, once I let go a little bit, all the lazy stuff is coming up. Yeah, the
I'm so glad you said that, because that's one of the most common fears. I will ask them, I'll say, do you have a fear that if you take some time off that you'll never want to exercise or work out again? And they said, yes, how do you know?
Yes, exactly.
It's a classic symptom of exhaustion. And what I will say to somebody is, if they've always have been someone who's enjoyed physical activity, that enjoyment factor will eventually come back. But right now their body is so exhausted. That's why they have this profound fear, because they know it's almost like they need to hibernate for a while. They need to heal. And that's the kindest thing to do to the body. In fact, it's funny, I will sometimes use, self-disclosure if I think it's going to help the patient. So I will often, I'm a pretty active individual, but I'll tell them, you know what, I decided to take the day off today to be kind to my body because I needed sleep. But I think as a culture that keeps worshiping athletes and the pursuit of exercise, that we have to recognize that rest is just as an important part of the equation. In fact, as an athlete, that was one of the hardest things I had to learn, is that the rest is just as important as the training.
Yeah, no one told us that, of course. So, and as you said, it's important to have a therapist or a counselor or some sort of support to when you're hibernating, as you said, and maybe gaining weight, which is maybe important if it's only a phase or not a phase, I don't know. But then it's really important to have the support to not fall back into the old restriction mode. So that leads me to one of the final questions. Like, I've talked to a lot of people who are teaching intuitive eating and are certified intuitive eating counselors. So how does one become an intuitive eating counselor? Can you describe the skills you're teaching people when they want to start working in this field?
Yeah, so we have two categories. We have the certified intuitive eating counselor, and then we have the certified intuitive eating facilitator. So basically, to qualify in the counselor track, you need to be some kind of health professional. That's probably the easiest way of describing it. But we've had people who've been just so taken back about how intuitive eating has changed their lives. They want to be able to offer it at their churches or their communities, which is why we have a facilitator track. But generally, here's the process. So we have a self-study and a test. That's the first phase, and they do that through Helm Publications. The second phase then is I do teleseminar trainings. Actually, it's so cool with technology. People from around the world learn how to do this, where this goes beyond just the knowledge of intuitive eating. It's how do you facilitate this process with your clients, and how do you facilitate it for yourself? Because the other thing is, if you have your own unresolved issues around eating in your body, you really can't take a person or a patient any further than you've taken yourself. So it's important that you also work on your own healing. And then the third component is doing, we call it supervision or coaching, where basically it's either individual or group, but where you're bringing in your own case stories and experiences, and we're really watching intuitive eating become alive in the stories of the different health professionals as they're working with people. And I tell you, it is so exciting to see the word spread. In fact, it was 2 years ago, I got contacted by a group of psychologists from Russia, out of Moscow, and because they wanted me to train them, and they opened up the first intuitive eating center in Moscow. So the more that we can have more allied health professionals promoting the same message, what a beautiful world. But imagine having a physician and a trainer and a therapist all giving the same message. You're using intuitive eating, but within your scope of practice. And like I said, you change lives. So I think we have over 500 people now around the world who are certified intuitive eating counselors, and it's growing day by day. It's very, very exciting.
What a beautiful world you're describing. Surely better than holding on to a thin dream that is never going to happen. Where can people find you if they want to work with you or ask you questions?
Well, there's a couple of ways. We have our intuitive eating website, so it's intuitiveeating.org, where there's my personal website, and that's evelyntribole.com. But one thing I just remember I want to mention, for those out there looking for support, we launched a free online community, the Intuitive Eating Community, and we have over 10,000 members now, and it's free to join, but we have membership just to keep the spammers out. And we have a certified intuitive eating counselor once a month leading a little teleseminar for questions that people might have to help them in their journey. So there's many ways to connect.
Beautiful. My final question to you is, what would you like to be remembered for?
Oh, my God. I guess making a difference in people's lives in a very meaningful and compassionate way. And that I was a nice person.
You did that already. I had a wonderful time talking to you. Thank you for taking your time.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome. Make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.